This sermon, preached by Dr. Lawrence Bash on Sunday, July the 2nd, 1967, was entitled, Freedom's Holy Light.
At the conclusion of this service, we are going to sing these words. Our Father God, to Thee, Author of liberty, to Thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by Thy might, great God, our King. I have taken for my topic those words, freedom's holy light, written deep into the tradition of our land and rooted deeply within the Christian tradition. As a text this morning, we go back to the psalmist. In the 33rd Psalm, in the 12th verse, we have read these words, Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The translation is a bit confusing. The Lord. This for us is the name of God. In the original Hebrew, this was Jehovah, or more properly, Yahweh. And it was the particular God whom they had met at Mount Sinai and out in the desert, the particular God as contrasted with all of the false gods of other lands, Ashdod or Baal or whomever, whom they knew as Jehovah or Yahweh, whom they called the Lord. So they are specifying a particular God, the only true God. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. That is, the nation which lives under the biblical revelation. The nation which recognizes the God whom we find in Old and New Testament. You can't argue with this as a part of our tradition, now can you? You can only argue the question as to whether we've lived up to it. There is not the slightest doubt that the American people, insofar as their slogans go, would believe this to be a valid part of our tradition. 10 years ago, our Pledge of Allegiance was modified. We inserted two words, under God. One nation under God. Under God. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. This is to accept both promise and claim. For as the Hebrew knew the promise and gift of God, so he knew the claim or demand of God for righteousness, for responsible living, for loving and obedient service. This is part of the tradition of your nation. Now you can, if you're young, as you will, I'm sure, tell me that we have never exemplified these words as well as we ought. I know this. I've read the muckraking books too. I know that just as we had pilgrim fathers who fled to this country in order to exercise their freedom of conscience, so there were scoundrels who came for their own devices. I know that for every saint we have had a sinner or two or three, certainly. I know all this. I know how we use history selectively. The past does not determine the future except in the sense that we choose from the past what will determine the future. And Americans have chosen from their past that their reach shall be greater than their grasp, that the ideals which have been formed, the best of our forefathers, should be kept alive. And because of this, I can, without any embarrassment whatsoever, come before you to talk about freedom's holy light. with the feeling that I speak within the tradition of my Christian forefathers and within the tradition of my American forefathers. As soon as I say it, I realize what a sticky proposition I'm dealing with. What word is there more abused in our time than freedom? Who is there with a cause so puny he can't use freedom to sell it? You listen to the New Left, as they call it, and their watchword will be freedom. You listen to the radical right, and you hear about freedom, and all the way in between. I suppose one of these days they'll be selling deodorant on the grounds of freedom. I don't know how they've overlooked it up to date. Freedom has become the great slogan to be put on whatever one wants to defend. As you see what's said and what's going on in our world, nothing is more apparent than that it becomes meaningless and has little relation to events. Now, I want to examine this whole issue this morning at a point that is sticky enough that it may compel you to do some thinking about what is involved in our common American and Christian heritage of freedom. That is, instead of taking some popular cause, which you would all want to jump on the bandwagon, I shall take an unpopular cause and ask you whether what we believe about freedom and say about it is really still valid and should be contended for in this complex age. You see, when I'm concerned about my rights and my privileges, it's easy for me to claim freedom. But when some strange, deviant character comes along and says he's acting in the name of freedom, well, that's a different matter, isn't it? Now, for example, strange, deviant character, well, I'm not sure that's the right phrase for this. Strange, all right. Here's the Reverend Cassius Clay, who has recently made the newspapers on grounds of religious conviction. He's a clergyman, as you doubtless have read. In his earlier days, before he took up the clergy, he beat the brains out of a number of citizens, made a good deal of money, a good deal of fame. Lately, Cassius has been committed to prison, or sentenced to prison. And after it makes its rounds through all the courts, you will know as soon as I what comes out of it. This is about as unpopular a case as I think is necessary for me to find in order to deal with it. I'm not trying Cassius Clay, and I really am not making a brief for him. I'm going to dismiss him completely as soon as I mention him in order to remind you of the complexity of the issues with which we deal today. I don't know what ought to be done with Cassius. I think that it's very difficult to convince the world of your sincerity in supporting the cause of nonviolence after you've just made so many $1 million with all the violence you can pack into 2 boxing gloves. And, of course, his status as a clergyman, well, it just raises eyebrows all over the place, doesn't it? But what about the man who stands against the tides of his time? For he is only one of quite a lot. There's Captain Levy, whose trial has but recently ended. And there was the Jewish boy up in the Pacific Northwest, whose case I lost track of, who went on a diet and he went on a fast, as it was. What about the 4,000 young men who have fled across the borders of this country into Canada because they choose not to participate in the armed services on grounds of conscience? What I hear about them is quite derogatory. Draft dodgers, cowards, etc. All this said by some people whose grandfather fled from Prussia on the same ground, as nearly as I can detect. Really, your grandfather, our great-grandfathers, fled from Prussia and other European countries in order to escape military conscription, and when I grew up, this was a matter of honor. We've forgotten this altogether. I'm not pleading the case of these 4,000. Many of them believe that because they are not very religious, their case would never clear, or not always can a man who is not in a religious body establish his conscientious conviction. This is part of it, part of an immensely complicated picture. All this is only an introduction to ask the question, what are the rights of conscience in the free society? Especially in a free society that is engaged in military conflict, which always begins to put our minds to sleep, especially in a mass society where the individual becomes less and less, more of a zero, where his rights tend to disappear, especially in an age of immense conformity, where the pressure to go along with the crowd is very great, especially in an age when, because the adult world has become so conformist, the youthful world has become so non-conformist, especially in a world of hippies and Vietniks and beatniks and peaceniks, especially in an age of persons whose conduct and appearance is likely to cause elderly ladies to frown. In fact, the whole conventional society to frown. Especially in an age of long hair, guitar music, strange dissonances coming across the television and radio. Especially in an age when a gulf is open between youth and age, such as we have not seen in our lifetime, friends. Especially in a time when communication has really been broken. When the hippie has turned his back upon the establishment so that whatever the establishment proposes, he must oppose. Especially in a time when this kind of nonconformity becomes the new conformity, or if I understand it aright, which I'm not sure of course, this young person is not free at all. Whatever father and mother say he ought to do, he will not do. He is a slave in reaction to whatever society says. In other words, in a time of immense moral and social confusion, when all our problems are exacerbated by the fact that there is military conflict, are we able to keep in mind what our nation was founded to gain and preserve? The free society, which means the society within which dissent is permitted, in which nonconformity is permitted, in which the individual conscience is allowed to speak. I don't often preach about conscientious objectors. In fact, I don't think I have ever preached about them in the years I've been here, because it is not very much of a practical problem, whether it ought to be or not. But as I hear what is being said in Congress, in the newspapers, on the streets, in all of the rich country clubs where I eat lunch constantly, as I hear what is being said, I ask myself whether you and I are being pounded into a mass conformity until we have forgotten what it is that makes a society free, and whether or not we are willing to stand up for the rights of the unpopular voice, of the dissenter, of the man who might be wrong, and indeed often is wrong. Freedom's holy light might go out in our time unless we use our 4th of Julys to remember what makes us free. In this land, for a very brief summary, except for World War II and in a fashion, the Civil War, we have not had military conscription until 1940. As soon as men were drafted into the military service, Congress set about to organize its mind on the legal status granted to those to whom this presented problems of conscience. Friend, there are people who read in the Old Testament, "Thou shalt not kill," and who read this in heightened form in the words of Jesus and in the words of Paul, "Overcome evil with good," for example, who believe they are conscientiously bound not to take the lives of other people, even in military service. This has never been a very large proportion of our society, but it has been a portion of our society which Congress has never been willing to override, because if it did, it would change the nature of our society. And the reason I am preaching this sermon this morning is we've forgotten this. 1940, the law provided, quote, "A person who by reason of religious training and belief is conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form," unquote, "may as an alternative to military duty perform," quote, "civilian work contributing to the maintenance of the national health, safety, or interest," unquote. According to figures released by the Selective Service Office last December, there were 5,148 conscientious objectors then performing alternative service, the largest number in that category in our history. During 1966, the total number classified as conscientious objectors, which includes those not yet assigned to alternative service, rose by about 1,000, and the total body presently under the heading CO is 20,765. The proportion of conscientious objectors has been rising slowly. In World War II, about 1 out of 1,000. During the decade of the 50s, about 1 out of each 600. Today, 1 out of each 350 to 400. Less than half of 1%. But our government, in fidelity to its very basic principles, has always said, when a man, because of his religious conviction, believes he cannot serve in the military, we must recognize this as a right. You don't hear this on the street. We're forgetting. And our church, along with every other church I know anything about, beginning with the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Brethren, which are totally pacifist in their conviction, but including the Roman Catholics and the Episcopalians and the Greek Orthodox, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, etc., have all said that when a man is coerced into military service against his conscience, his church must stand beside him. Now, it is quite possible for one who does not himself accept the pacifist position, or at least the total pacifist position, to stand by a man who does, and to give him such moral encouragement as he may think justified at that time. Friend, there isn't anyone who's come to me asking, how do I become a conscientious objector? I have chosen this because I am concerned about the drift of the popular mind in our country, in which little by little we are demanding more and more conformity to the majority point of view, with less and less respect for the dissenter. This is getting easier because dissenters are getting odder. They look funny. They thumb their nose at the establishment. They're rude to political figures. They're sassy to their fathers and mothers. And I have to stop and remember that they represent a right that was won at great cost, which I must defend whether I agree with it or not. I don't often advertise movies, not favorably anyway, but I would like to commend to you the movie A Man for All Seasons, which I finally got around to. Of course, you saw it months before I did, I imagine. Story of Sir Thomas More, the man of unimpeachable conscience, the cause which he pled and for which ultimately he was beheaded was a cause I find it hard to get in step with. The absolute moral authority of the Pope within the Roman Catholic Church at the time when the Church of England was being separated. The cause which he was opposed to himself was not a very popular one. Henry VIII, his wife after wife, came and went. But nonetheless, the question was not the particular cause and whether it could be defended or not. As I watched this scene develop as a man of granite was shown forth on the screen, I thought, what an anachronism. Why are they making a movie about that kind of a man in our kind of a world? We don't know what that means at all. We are the people of moral relativity. We are those who compromise so quickly at the drop of a hat, before the hat ever gets dropped. We are the people who have forgotten what an impregnable conscience means. Now, friend, the 4th of July is right around the corner. The time has come to remember our heritage. We call this a free society. When we say a free society, what do we mean? If it does not mean a society in which we recognize the conscience of other men, and even when they're wrong, like Voltaire, of course, we are willing to defend their right to dissent and their right to their own free choice of conviction. Freedom's holy light can go out in this kind of world altogether too quickly. I do not believe in the last 5 years I have heard anybody outside of an occasional religious public speaker defend on the streets of this city or elsewhere the right of conscientious objection. So I picked this unpopular theme, friend, in order that you might have something to mull over along with the golf game and the big dinner and the baseball game and the television when we come to the day of remembrance of a nation that was brought into being by men who fled across a sea because they wanted to determine and make steadfast their right to belief as they saw fit. What does it mean to say, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord"? Let us pray. Our Father and our God, help us to make this 4th of July a day of real meaning, as we think not of our might, steel and stone, but of the power of the human spirit freed from all kinds of tyrannies and bondages, except those that we impose ourselves without even thinking. Grant us a renewal of our national spirit, the nation under God, through Christ our Lord. Amen.